Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's free weekly e-newsletter, Unleashing Your Remarkable Potential, which is full of articles and resources to help you become a more confident and successful leader. Sign up by going to remarkablepodcast.com/newsletter. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody. A couple questions for you before we get started. Would you like to trust yourself more? And if you did, do you believe you could get better results? Today, we'll be joined by an expert to help us think through those questions and ultimately achieve more with less stress. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner if you're listening on the actual podcast by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. And while you're here, if you're with us live, I want you to imagine that you're joining us for a cup of coffee. Just share your questions, your comments, and your ideas. I will see them and I will share them with our guest, and they will make for a better conversation and eventually a better podcast episode too. So today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each month we release a new skill in an advanced form of a masterclass format designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill or to get discounts each month can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. Let me introduce to you our guest. I'll let her join us. There she is. Let me tell you all about her. Our guest today is Melody Wilding. She has coached hundreds of private clients, from CEOs and Fortune 500 executives to leaders from the U.S. Department of Education, the Federal Reserve, and the United Nations. She teaches graduate level human behavior and psychology at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College in New York. Her writing is regularly featured on Medium and in Forbes, Business Insider, and Quartz. Her advice has been featured in the New York Times, The Cut, Oprah Magazine, NBC News, U.S. News and World Report, and more. And she's here today to talk about her brand new book, Trust Yourself. We're going to talk about that. Melody, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So I'm looking at that introduction, which they get, for everybody else, they get sent to us, and then I usually tweak them. And then I didn't do what you need to make sure they do, Melody, which is make sure that the intro says the name of the book.
Yes, you might have gotten an older bio.
Well, that's okay. I added it, obviously. It's all good. Man, I'm so glad that you are here. And for all of you that are joining us live, there we go. We got good morning. People telling us where they're from. And we love that, all the way from Michigan to Saudi Arabia so far.
Incredible. I love that. I love that.
And so for those of you that are joining us, tell us where you're from. Tell us what questions you have. We'll make sure we try to answer them as we go. But I'm going to ask you, Melody, the question that I often ask people when we start, and that is, tell us about your journey. Like, you didn't wake up when you were 4 and say, I'm going to, teach human behavior courses at the graduate level. You didn't wake up one morning and say, I think I'll write a book. Well, you did, but not when you were 7. And so tell us just a little bit about how you ended up where you're at now. I know there's some life events that happened that led you to this point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And this book really came about because of my clinical and my educational experiences combined with my personal experiences and story. And those two things really gelled together nicely. So now it all feels synchronous. I can look back and see the pieces were there, but it certainly didn't feel that way. So, growing up, I always knew that I was someone who was more sensitive. I was told that by people around me that, oh, you're so sensitive. You take things so personally. I was just, as a child, so fundamentally affected by everything that went on around me. And I didn't really think much of it. I thought everyone was like that. Of course, as I grew up, came to find out that they weren't. But I didn't have language for it back then. And I really thought it was a weakness within myself, that I was so empathetic, that I thought and I felt everything so deeply. And
in fact, if I can interrupt you there, some of the people that told you that said it in a way that led you to believe it was a weakness, didn't they?
Well, yeah, 100%. And I want to say my family is always has been incredibly supportive and kind of me being having a big heart and wearing my heart on my sleeve in that way. But yes, I think societally we have this conditioning around toughen up, grow a thicker skin. Why do you take everything so personally? You're so high maintenance. Don't be emotional, right? We get that messaging, especially as leaders. Don't bring your emotions into the workplace. And so, definitely was someone who fell victim to that, but was also really high achieving on this other side, was very extremely hard on myself, my own worst critic. Uh, and I was your classic gold star good girl, live to exceed expectations in everything I do, get straight A's, don't step out of line. And so I was very successful and graduated top of my class, went on to get a good job, and very early on in my career burnt out very severely to the point where I was having heart palpitations and nightmares. I could not get out of bed. And it was because I had let my sensitivity really go unmanaged and unleveraged. I had built up so many bad habits, people pleasing, my perfectionism, not being able to manage stress, not being emotionally resilient to that. And so it was really that crisis moment that was a wake up call for me. And luckily, I had a background. I have a background as a social worker, so as a therapist. So I had all of the tools that I needed. I just needed to turn them on
Use them on
myself.
yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, so we get to this point now where you've written this book, Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking, and Channel Your Emotions for Success at Work is the full title. Tell us I mean, it's a great title, so maybe it's a bit obvious, but what's the really big idea of the book?
Yeah, the big idea is that when managed correctly, your sensitivity and your ambition, what feels like it is a burden right now, can be your superpower. But you have to stop being so attuned and attached to external outcomes and other people's definition of success. And you need to start listening to and trusting yourself instead of being so dictated around by fear, self doubt, imposter syndrome, and allowing that to get in your way and keep you small.
All right. So we've had a couple of other guests in the past talk about imposter syndrome. So I'll make sure in the show notes, everybody, for those who listen to the podcast, that we connect you to those as well. I love one of the things I love about the book, Melody, is that, I always, because I read a lot, always have, but also because I get all these books about and then decide about who I'm going to have on the show. One of the first things I do is look at the table of contents, right? And so I look at the table of contents of this book and I see that there are 4 chunks. And I think it's useful. I'm going to just put them up on the screen for those that are watching. And the four parts, or the 4 sections of the book, are self-awareness, self-sabotage, self-confidence, self-growth. So do you want to speak to that sort of, I'll call it a journey across those 4? Do you want to speak to that just a little bit? Because I think it'll give people a flavor of maybe where we're heading with this conversation, and maybe some questions that people that are here live might want to ask.
Absolutely. So the book, really, when I went into the process of writing it, I'm a big reader as well. You can tell from behind me, and I always get frustrated with books that start out with having you define your big why, your purpose. Because, and I think this is true for many sensitive strivers, that we have so many things that are getting in our way that it's hard to access that higher level thinking about our biggest ambitions, our purpose, our passions, without first getting some of the self sabotage out of the way first. So that's exactly why I wanted to sort of flip the traditional approach to professional and personal development on its head and start with building self awareness. We do have to start there, specifically with understanding who you are as what I call a sensitive striver. Someone who is both high achieving, so very driven, puts a lot of pressure on yourself, enjoy reaching your goals, but also highly sensitive. And so really understand that this is a trait difference. It's part of who you are, but also understand how it has shaped your view of yourself and your career. And then we move on to part 2, which is taming self-sabotage. So a lot of those things that are getting in your way, like overthinking, people pleasing, perfectionism, overfunctioning, emotional reactivity. So there is pretty much a chapter on each of those, so we can tame those self-sabotaging habits, give you mental and emotional energy to start transforming your qualities into a strength. And then in part 3 is where we pivot and we zoom out. So if we're focusing more on the day to day in part 2, in part 3, we really zoom out and start to define what your definition of success is. Not one that is based on what you think you should do or the expectations other people have of you, but really defining what would be personally meaningful to you and designing a sustainable way to go after that. And then part 4, we wrap everything up with sustaining self-growth. Since, again, being an author and a coach, what I care about is long-lasting change, not just quick fixes, but making sure that you can actually follow through, overcome obstacles like setbacks, but also having to navigate pushback from other people as you're starting to change and being assertive in those types of scenarios.
And that everybody is a really good outline and of the thought process of the book, and it gives us lots of room to work. And so what I decided to do, Melody, in going through the book was to just pull out some things. And I don't mean it to be a test, because it's not what it is, because I've been there, right? Like I've read the book since you have, right? Like, let's be clear, right? So it's not meant to be that, but there's some things that you talked about that I thought were especially interesting to me, and I think will be interesting to others.
Mm-hmm.
And Lucy, I know you had a question, and I'll get to it later. Don't think I've forgotten you or ignored it. I just think it's going to be better later. But so there's several things that I just have pulled, and I just thought they'd be a springboard for conversations. I hope that you're willing to play along with that. You talk a little bit about, you ask a question about where we seek permission. And I think it plays into several. I don't even remember where it is in the book in terms of what you just laid out, but it could certainly fit in more than one of those sections. And so, I mean, awareness, sabotage, confidence, right? So talk about what you mean by this question, why this question is so powerful, and perhaps maybe where this messes us up a bit.
Mm-hmm. And so I see this idea of permission seeking all the time with my clients who are extremely high achieving, Fortune 500 leaders and executives, but they have a very high dependence on other people's approval, to the point where it can preclude them from taking chances, making judgment calls in their careers. They may worry about what senior leadership is going to think of them. Or a lot of times people worry about what their team is going to think of them, and they avoid conflict and confrontation. And so this idea of permission seeking, of course, we all permission seek. It's instinctive. We all want to belong. But for sensitive strivers, when we're unbalanced, as I call it, that desire for approval and validation can really escalate to a dependency where we need it. We are constantly seeking out ways to say, to get from other people, am I good enough? Am I doing a good job? We poll people, for example, to see if our ideas are any good before going forward from them, rather than trusting our own judgment. So it's really this idea of being so outwardly focused and being so needy for approval that you're not listening to yourself.
So this is where I think, and here's a specific reason why I asked this question, Melody, is that, there's a wonderful practice for us as leaders, and that is to work to gain consensus, or at least to gain input, to get other people's ideas, to not take it all as our own. And you can quickly see where my reason for getting that input might be to prove my idea or to get permission from the group, rather than to really find the best solution. And so that takes us back to self-awareness, and neither Melody or I can answer that question for you. But as you watch or listen, that's worth thinking about. Like, why do I elicit the input from others. Why do I do that? And there's really good reasons. But as Melody said, there's perhaps the other side of that coin we just want to be very aware of. Do you want to add anything to that point?
Oh, 100%. My clients ask me that all the time of what's the line between trying to build alignment and consensus and permission seeking. And you said it very well, which is motivation, right? You have to know your reasoning and your motivation behind wanting to do that. And I always advise my clients that before trying to seek and build that consensus, that you have a point of view first. Even if you're not 100% sure in it, at least you take the time to think through and turn inward to say, what do I think about this? And if I had to formulate a judgment here, what would that be? And then I can go out there first. But often we skip over that and we try to outsource that decision making, for example. So yeah,
Now,
completely
one
agree
other
with
thing I'll add to that, I agree 100%. The only thing I would add
that.
to everybody is just because you now have that opinion, don't start with it. Because if you're the boss and you start with it, you're right back to just getting permission as opposed to really getting their input.
Exactly.
So right on. Now, Luciano, I promised you I'd come back to your question because I think it fits now. So I'm going to read this and you can just respond to it, Melody. Luciano says, I believe people in general overthink issues or problems when upper leadership doesn't know how to communicate with others. Do you believe this to be true or false? Anything you want to say about that point?
Oh, 100%. A lack of clarity, ambiguity drives our minds crazy. Our minds are meaning making machines, especially sensitive strivers. We are naturally deep thinkers. I was alluding to a little earlier that this is actually a genetic trait difference that a certain amount of the population has, about 15 to 20%. So 1 in 5 people is a sensitive striver, or you may be one yourself, but has this different neurological wiring that leads you to process information more deeply. And when we look at MRIs of the sensitive brain, we actually see that areas related to depth of processing of information and connecting ideas, synthesizing, actually light up more in the sensitive brain. So it's a very real thing. But to answer your question, absolutely, that ambiguity drives overthinking because our mind is constantly trying to solve those loops. And if there's ambiguity, if there's gray area, that's a lot more difficult. And so with so many of my clients and even in the book, I talk so much about being clear about expectations, about being assertive, to ask for that clarity and being upfront, because you're right that can really lead you astray.
You know, in math, I was just thinking about this as you were saying that. In math, we're asked to solve for X. We know what we're trying to solve for, right? And so often here, and in the example that Luciano gives, and as you're describing, if we don't know what we're solving for, it just keeps us in this loop of thinking, right? And it makes it very difficult for us to even know when we've been successful, if you will. Excuse me. Since you mentioned expectations, there's a chapter in the book which I think is incredibly valuable. It's valuable for us individually, as really how you write it. It's valuable for us as leaders, as teammates, especially in this remote world of working. And it's about boundaries. So you use the word boundaries rather than expectations. But talk about, give us some insight into how we build boundaries, why it's so important to build them. Just talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, and as you said, I would use boundaries interchangeably with expectations. A boundary is a limit, right? That defines your preferences, your needs. It acts like a fence that determines what you let in and what you keep out. And so you want to make sure that that fence is healthy, that it's not a brick wall where nothing can get in, which is when you're so rigid about the way things need to be done, or so rigid about your time that you have no flexibility. But you also don't want to be completely porous, where that's where we get into people pleasing tendency, where you will react and accommodate any request that comes your way, for example. And boundaries are so important now because we don't have as many artificial external boundaries like we did. We don't leave the office. We're so integrated now between work and life that we need to construct those for ourselves. And so I think for many people, internal boundaries, really being able to compartmentalize work situations, has been incredibly difficult now because you don't have your commute where you have that disconnection between, work and home life. And so really being able to switch off at the end of the day, or not let a situation or a stress follow you into your family time, has been huge. As is it setting those limits and those expectations with coworkers, your manager, about when you can accomplish things, how responsive you'll be. All of that is so important now.
Yeah. Yeah. And, quite honestly, that's been true. I mean, so we're having this conversation. Those of you that are here live know that we're having this conversation at the end of April. And if you listen to this podcast when it first comes out and, in the middle of May of 2021, some of you might be watching this or listening to this way later. And I would say that as important as all of that, that's always important, like for sure, 100%. You've described how it's has heightened importance now as we've been working from home. And I'll just tell you all that as you move into a world where you might be working at home some of the days and in an office some of the days, it's a new set of complexities. This is not going to get easier. And it's going to become, if anything, even more important for the work and life parts of this, although there are boundaries in all parts of our lives, as you already said.
Yes.
So I want to go back to something that you said at the beginning in the opening, when you talked about being a sensitive striver, but specifically that word sensitive. And we talked a little bit about emotions and, that many people, or that maybe society in general, sees those as a weakness. But you straight up come out and say in the book that emotions are a competitive advantage. And so I love that. I love that line. I think it's exactly right. Maybe because it's me too. I don't know. But talk to that specifically, especially speak to that to the person who's very cynical or questioning of that statement.
Yeah, and it can again, this comes back to our conditioning. And if anybody has ever been at the mercy of their emotions, where you have been reactive or snapped at someone, for example, or been overwhelmed, it's hard to imagine how emotions
Which is
are an
all of us,
advantage.
by the way.
Oh,
All
we
of
have
us
all
have done
been
that.
there.
Every single
Yes.
one has done it.
Yes. And so what I would encourage people to think about is emotions are empathy and emotional intelligence, right? So we can't have emotional intelligence without emotion regulation, which I have an entire chapter on that in the book, of how to really control and manage your emotions in the moment. But outside of that, really being able to be empathetic, sensitive strivers have more active mirror neurons, which are the empathy neuron in the brain that leads us to be able to perceive and observe other people's behavior, to really enter their experience and understand it. And so we have this heightened capacity to understand other people's emotions and motivations, which makes you better at influencing them, for example, persuading them, getting a certain outcome, and I mean in an authentic way, to surface blockers or tension. I'll tell you a great story about this. I have one client who works at a media company, and they were going to be changing a major technology that they were using. And because she is someone who was more sensitive and attuned to not only her emotions, but everybody else around her, she was able to anticipate the fact that there was going to be a ton of tension between the technology, the engineering team, and the product team, who were really at odds. And she saw it coming a mile away. And so she was able to intervene early to build alignment on both sides, to surface some of the tension and the conflict, and actually bring people together in a room. So she was able to really adeptly navigate people's anger and really appease and smooth over the situation, that led to actually the technology change being very successful and going faster than anticipated, which most people know that never happens. But if she had not been there and she had not been so high in empathy and emotional intelligence, that wouldn't have happened, and it would have been a debacle.
It would have
So
been an
really,
explosion rather than something that she could help corral the energy of both groups to create something
exactly.
better.
Hmm.
So, trust yourself. And we are talking with Melody Wilding about her new book, Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking and Channel Your Emotions for Success at Work. Here it is. if we think about, if to the uninitiated, which is all of us except you, when we think about that word trust, those words trust yourself, we might go to the word intuition, right? And so you talk in the book about living in fear versus living in intuition. So can you talk about that just for a second?
Sure. And let me back up a little bit because I think sometimes when we hear the word intuition, we get a little like, ooh, is this spiritual? This feels a little woo-woo. And I want to ground this because I very intentionally use the word intuition because I believe, much like sensitivity, it's a word we need to start reclaiming and redefining for what it is. And your intuition is really your memory. It's really this subconscious, incredibly fast, happens in fractions of a microsecond, where your mind does a calculation. It goes back through all of your various experiences, your preferences, your memories, and it pulls the best answer for a situation based on what has happened in the past. And so as sensitive strivers, because we are processing what's happening around us more deeply, we're taking in more information, we have a deeper pool of data to pull from, but we don't always listen to it. We don't always factor it into our decision making. And I want to be clear that I'm also not advocating for just entirely listening to your intuition and forsaking all logic, but rather that they have to be combined together. And so that's really what I talk about in the book, is that we need to uh, value and make space for our intuition for many reasons. But especially in this environment, people tend to be so busy that that voice is crowded out. We don't make time to listen to ourselves, or we're getting so much input from other people that we don't have space to tune into what we're feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of other things that you and I could talk about, I know, and that people would enjoy. And there's a limit to how long we can go. And so before I get to the questions that I definitely want to end with, I'll just ask you this. Is there something we didn't talk about that you thought we would or wish we would? Or I guess a final thought, something else that you'd like to talk about before we start to go into the home stretch here?
Well, let me also finish the fear versus intuition, because I want to give people some tools to differentiate between the two. So,
Okay,
fear
cool.
tends to be very chaotic. It tends to feel like frenetic energy. I often say it feels like a pushing energy, as if you feel forced, or if you're trying to avoid shame, rejection, humiliation. It tends to feel like constricting in your body. It makes you feel small. Whereas intuition tends to feel, whether it's pointing you to do something or to not do something, it tends to be more calm, right? It tends to be that quieter inner voice. It tends to feel more spacious, expansive. It feels like pulling energy, like something you're being pulled towards your best interest. And so that process of discernment, and we were talking about that earlier, about discerning your motivations for seeking validation, this is that as well.
All right. So I am going to shift gears as promised. And people
Yes.
who have listened before know what I'm going to ask you next, but I don't know that you know. Melody, what do you do for fun?
What I do for fun, I do yoga, I cook, and I play with my cat, which is probably the dorkiest answer ever, but I am one of those people.
I don't know about that. I mean, it is what it is, right? Playing with the cat. I don't know if it's the dorkiest answer, but I think it's the first time I've heard that on this show. 200, as I told you earlier, 266 episodes in. I think that's the first time someone's told me that. So
I strive to be
now I
different.
want to know. You mentioned it, and if people are watching, they can see it behind you. What are you reading now, or what's something you've read recently that people might find interesting?
Yeah, I recently read Ethan Cross's book Chatter, which is fantastic. A fantastic book about really navigating that our inner voice of self doubt. Fantastic book.
Chatter by Ethan Cross. We'll have
Cross.
that in the show notes as Cross, you said, right?
Kross. Yes.
Kross. We'll have that in the show notes, of course, everybody, as we always do. So where can people learn more? Where do you want to point people as they, where can they find the book? What do you want to say? Where do you want to point people to learn more about the book, your work, or you, where do you want to send people?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. You can find more about the book at melodywilding.com/book, and melodywilding.com is the best place to connect with me as well.
There you go. And we got people in the chat saying that they are right with you on the yoga scenario. Just saying.
Nice.
So, and now I have a question for all of you as you get the chance to write that down, melodywilding.com/book, if you want the book. And now a question for all of you that are watching and listening, and it is this. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? Maybe you got an insight from Melody about fear versus intuition. Maybe you got an insight from her about self-awareness. It could be any of the things we talked about, but the only thing that I can tell you for sure, that is, if you don't take any action as a result of this, there's nothing really going to change. So it does require you to do something different, something new, and I challenge you, urge you, encourage you to do that as a result of our time together. So Melody, thank you so much for being here. It was an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. I loved it.
Well, everybody, we're here every week, and so you should come on back. Now, next week on this live, it's going to be another person with a book. They're not going to be on the podcast, but every week we have a new podcast, and every week we're here live, and many times it's both the same. And if you're not on the inside as a member of our LinkedIn or Facebook groups, then why not? Why aren't you? Because that's where you can get all the details. You can get additional insights. You can get a chance to interact with me, to ask questions, all that. It's all free. All you got to do is go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. And I know whether you do that or not, I'll be back here next week. We'll see you for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.